The bronze sun beats down on the plain of Troy like a hammer on an anvil, and the air is thick with the stink of hot iron, horse piss, and the sweet rot stink of men who have already begun to die inside their armor. A myrmidon spear punches through a Trojan throat with a wet pop, blood jets black in the glare, and the dying man's scream is cut short as his windpipe fills with his own life. Shields clash, ashwood cracks, the ground turns to red mud under 1,000 trampling feet. Somewhere in that churning slaughter stands a figure taller than any mortal, cuirass blazing like molten copper, plume the color of fresh arterial spray. His eyes are not eyes at all, but burning holes, and every man who meets them feels his bowels loosen. Ares the god every Greek mother cursed under her breath, walks the battlefield tasting the panic, drinking the terror. Like wine, and the Greeks hate him for it more than they hate the Trojans because Ares does not choose sides, he only chooses carnage. When the day is done and the crows are too full to fly, the survivors crawl away whispering that no god is more loathed on Olympus than this one, this grinning butcher who laughs when children die. Long before the walls of Troy ever rose, the poets already knew the name that made hardened warriors blanch. Homer calls him man-slaughtering, city-sacking, blood-stained, the curse of mortals, a god who delights in the moment when the bronze point slides between ribs and the light goes out of a young man's eyes. Hesiod is blunter still. Ares is the only Olympian Zeus openly despises a son he calls most hateful to me of all the gods, because even the king of heaven cannot control the raw screaming hunger that lives inside him. In the old hymns he has no clever tricks, no shining inventions, no songs, only the roar of onset and the stink of open bellies. While Athena brings the cold strategy that wins wars, Ares is the hot madness that starts them and keeps them burning long after any sane man would have stopped. The Spartans chained his statue so he could not desert the battlefield. The Athenians barely gave him an altar at all. Even the Amazons, those daughters of war, claimed he was too savage for their taste. Why did a people who lived by the spear fear the god of the spear above all others? Because Ares never lies about what war actually is. Not glory, not honor, just the wet red moment when one man's guts steam on the ground while another man tries not to vomit inside his helmet. From the beginning he was trouble. When Hera, furious at one of Zeus's endless infidelities, decided to bear a child without him, she touched the flower that made conception possible and brought forth this monster in a single night of agony. No gentle cradle songs for Ares. His first lullaby was the grinding of bronze on bronze as the Titans still rattled their chains in Tartarus. He grew fast and monstrous, taller than any mortal king, voice like bronze gates slamming shut. His nurses were not nymphs but the Keres, those black-wind spirits who drink blood from open wounds, and his playthings were the iron weapons left over from the Titan war. By the time he could walk he was already striding across Thrace, that frozen northern land where men fought naked in the snow, and women rode to war with bared breasts, teaching them new ways to kill. There he fathered a brood as savage as himself, Diomedes of Thrace, who fed strangers to his mares. Sickness who could not be wounded by iron, even the Amazons traced their blood to his reckless seed. But then the stories truly begin, and the first great tale that belongs to Ares alone is the one the Greeks loved to tell against him, the day a mortal man looked the god of war in the face and did not die. It happened beneath the walls of Troy in the 10th year, when the Greeks were weary and the wine had turned to vinegar in their cups. Diomedes, son of Tydeus, the same Diomedes whose grandfather Aeneas had once entertained the gods, stood in his chariot with sweat-cutting channels through the dust on his face. Athena, who hated Ares almost as much as Zeus did, leaned close and peeled the mist from the young man's eyes so he could see gods walking among men. And there he was, Ares himself, huge and laughing, driving the Trojan lines like cattle before a forest fire. Athena pressed her hands over Diomedes' shoulders and whispered that today the impossible might happen. She gave him strength beyond strength, and she gave him a spear that would bite divine flesh. What followed was blasphemy made bronze. Diomedes charged straight at the god, chariot wheels screaming, and drove that spear through the sculpted belly of Ares' warbelt. The point grated on immortal muscle, tore through god flesh that had never known pain, and Ares bellowed a sound so huge that both armies staggered and horses bolted in panic. Black ichor, the blood of the undying, poured down his thighs like tar. For one stunned heartbeat, the god of war stood impaled and gaping like any mortal recruit who has just discovered what the inside of his body looks like. Then he wrenched himself free, clutched the wound, and fled upward through the sky, trailing a comet tail of divine blood, while the Greeks below roared in disbelief that any man had wounded the unwoundable. Up on Olympus he crashed howling into his father's palace, showed Zeus the ragged hole in his perfect body, and received nothing but disgust. "Sit down and stop whining," thundered the cloud-gatherer. "I hate you most of all my children." That was the first time a mortal ever made Ares run. But then came the scandal that made even the gods blush behind their hands. Ares, for all his ferocity, was as helpless as any soldier when Aphrodite walked past trailing perfume and sea foam. The two met in secret, away from the jealous eye of Hephaestus her husband, and their embraces shook the bedsprings of heaven itself. Helios the sun, who sees everything, carried the tale to the crippled smith, and Hephaestus forged a net of bronze so fine it was invisible, yet stronger than any chain ever beaten on his anvil. When the lovers' necks tumbled together, laughing and careless, the net fell. It pinned them naked and struggling while Hephaestus summoned every god to come and mock. Poseidon had to bite his knuckles to keep from laughing outright. Hermes confessed he would not mind changing places. Even the goddesses came, though they pretended to look away. Ares burned crimson with shame, the great war god caught like a rabbit, and only paid a staggering fine to buy his way out of the chains. From that day every soldier who ever tripped over his own spear or found himself tangled in his cloak could claim the god of war himself had once been humiliated worse. Here is the twist the poets loved. The same. Ares, who fled from Diomedes, once stood almost alone against the giants when Gaia birthed her final revenge. In the Gigantomachy, when Earth herself shook off mountains like fleas and every god felt the old Titan terror again, Ares was there in the front rank. Porphyrion, the king of giants, seized Hera and tried to violate her in the middle of the battlefield. Ares heard her scream and charged without waiting for orders. He caught the giant by the hair, dragged him backward, and buried a spear so deep in his throat that the point came out the nape. Later, when the giant Enceladus tried to bury the gods beneath Sicily itself, Ares leapt onto his back and rode him like a runaway horse until Heracles could finish him with arrows dipped in the Hydra's gall. Even Athena admitted that day that her brother's blind fury had its uses. Skip ahead for the darkest moment, because there is one story about Ares so black that most cities refuse to tell it aloud. In the wild hills of Boeotia stood the dragon of Thespia, a serpent born from the blood of Typhon, its scales harder than Chalcidian bronze, its breath pure poison. The men of Thespia chained living prisoners to the rocks and left them for the beast, hoping to buy another year of life. One spring they chained a boy named Cleostratus, barely old enough for his first beard, and the dragon came slithering down the cliff with a sound like 1,000 swords dragged across stone. But Cleostratus was no ordinary offering. He was the secret son of Ares himself, born to a mortal woman the god had taken in a night of drunken violence. When Ares felt the blood call of his own child about to die, something cracked inside the war god. He descended in a storm of iron and fire, caught the dragon by the throat, and did not kill it cleanly. He tore it slowly, scale by scale, limb from limb, roaring with a grief no battlefield had ever dragged from him. The ground for miles around was salted with dragon blood and god tears, and ever after nothing grew there except the red poppies that drunkards call the flowers of Eris. That was the only time the sources record the god weeping. And just when it seems Ares can sink no lower in the eyes of men, the myths remember the trial of Halirrhothius. Poseidon's son raped Alcip, daughter of Ares, in the very shadow of the Acropolis. Ares caught him in the act, dragged him out by the hair, and beat him to death with his bare fists until the stones were slick, and the boy's own mother would not have known his face. The gods put Ares on trial for murder, the first homicide trial in history, and Poseidon demanded blood for blood. But the 12 Olympians listened to the girl's testimony, saw the bruises on her thighs, and for once even the sea god had no words. They acquitted Ares on the hill that still bears the name Areopagus, the hill of Ares, where later the Athenians would try their bloodiest cases beneath the stars. War, the verdict said, sometimes wears the face of justice. The catalogue of his humiliations and his rare, terrible triumphs goes on. Otis and Alus, the giant twins, once chained him inside a bronze jar for 13 months until Hermes stole him out half-mad and stinking. The Aladi thought they could force Hera to marry one and Artemis the other, and only Ares' captivity kept Olympus from open civil war. Cadmus slew his dragon and sowed the teeth that sprang up as armored men who slaughtered each other until only 5 remained, the Spartoi who founded Thebes. In every corner of the Greek world some trace of Ares lingers, the spring on Crete where he was born, the vultures that nested on his shield, the wolves that howled when he passed overhead. Yet for all his terror, the Greeks gave him almost nothing. Athens had one small temple below the Acropolis, built only after they began to fear the Persians more than they feared war itself. Sparta chained his image so he could not run away. Thebes sacrificed puppies to him before battle because only something that savage deserved his attention, and even then they did it at night so decent people would not see. In Thrace alone they honored him openly with horse sacrifices and rivers of blood, because the Thracians understood that war is not a visitor, it is the master of the house. They called him the Unbound, the Rhaegar, he who turns men into wolves. Greek mothers terrified their children into silence by whispering that. Ares walked the rooftops at night listening for the cries of the disobedient. Soldiers who survived a battle sometimes smashed their weapons on an altar to Ares and swore never to fight again, as if the god could be bribed with broken bronze. There were rituals of binding. Black-robed priests wrapped iron chains around his statues and buried them face down so the spirit of war would stay asleep. On the rare festivals they unchained him, beat dogs to death, and danced naked with swords until the first man fell and his blood woke the god again. What does it say about a people when they treat their war god like a mad dog that must be muzzled? In the end, Ares stands alone among the bright Olympians, unloved, unlovable, necessary. He is the truth no victory song ever admits, that every triumph is built on a mountain of corpses, that courage and terror are the same pulse in the throat, that the difference between hero and butcher is only who lives long enough to tell the story. He is the moment when the bronze finds flesh and the world tilts forever. The Greeks feared him because they saw themselves in him, stripped of every illusion, and what they saw was unbearable. We chain our own wars now with laws and treaties and careful words, but the smell of hot blood and the taste of iron on the tongue have not changed since the first spear left the first hand. Somewhere beneath the polite masks of civilization, Ares still walks, grinning, patient, waiting for the chains to slip. If these unflinching tailies dragged from the ashes of the Bronze Age leave you hungry for more, consider subscribing to Ancient Epics. We promise never to look away. Thanks for watching.